Hey everyone, welcome to your deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
Today we're going to be looking at the psychology of hoarding. It's something that you were really interested in, and you sent a bunch of really cool research and articles about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to say, I'm really fascinated to kind of dig into this with you. I think we're going to be able to get to some really interesting stuff about, why people hoard.
Yeah, it's definitely something that goes a little deeper than just thinking about clutter. We're really going to get into, the mind of somebody who hoards. And I think that's going to be really eye-opening.
Yeah, one of the things I was thinking about when I was looking at the research you sent was, is there a difference between collecting and hoarding? Like, where's the line? I love collecting old books, but, my partner might say that my office is getting a little cluttered.
Yeah, that's the question a lot of people have, right? And it's really the perfect place to start because it's an important distinction. I want you to think about it this way. A collector is proud of their collection. They organize it, they show it off. There's a sense of control and enjoyment in it. So you can think about somebody who has this beautiful display of vintage cameras, and each one is, carefully chosen, and they're kept in pristine condition.
Yeah, that makes sense. They have a reason for every item,
Yeah.
and they appreciate it. It's not just random stuff.
Exactly. And on the other hand, you have hoarding, which is characterized by this really strong need to save items. And these items often have very little value to other people. And it gets to a point where the amount of stuff is just overwhelming. And it can lead to clutter and distress. So it's not even necessarily just about the amount of stuff. It's really the impact it's having on their life and well-being.
So even if somebody had a huge collection of something, but it was organized and they were happy with it, that wouldn't be hoarding.
Yeah, it really comes down to the relationship they have with the items and how it's affecting their life. So if somebody's feeling overwhelmed by their possessions, even if they are organized, that could be a sign of hoarding.
This is where it starts to get really interesting to me, because some of this research you sent points to a genetic component of hoarding disorder. Is it really in our DNA?
There is growing evidence that genetics can play a role. Researchers have linked a specific abnormality on chromosome 14 to information processing and decision-making, which we know is involved in hoarding behaviors.
Okay, but how does a chromosome affect how somebody thinks about their stuff?
Well, genes, they provide the blueprint for how our brains are wired. So this particular abnormality, it might influence how people process information that's related to their possessions, maybe even their emotional attachment to objects, and how they decide what to keep and what to get rid of.
So somebody with this kind of genetic predisposition, they might have a harder time letting go of things, even if they're not valuable or even useful.
Exactly. And what's really fascinating? One of your sources said that 80% of people with hoarding disorder have a first-degree relative, like a parent or a sibling, who also hoards. So that's actually way higher than a lot of other mental health conditions.
Wow, 80%. That's a big number.
Yeah.
So that really strengthens the idea that genes are playing a part here. But it also makes me wonder, if hoarding runs in families, could it be more about learned behavior than genetics?
That's a great question. And it's something that researchers are still, figuring out. It's probably a really complex combination of both nature and nurture. So somebody might have a genetic predisposition, but their environment and their life experiences can definitely influence whether they develop hoarding disorder or not.
So it's not a guarantee that if your parents hoard, you will too.
Right. It's more like you have a vulnerability, but a lot of other factors come into play.
This is really fascinating stuff. But I think, a lot of people, myself included, wonder, why is it so hard to let go of things? I've definitely felt that kind of twinge of regret when I've had to throw something away, even if it's something I haven't used in years.
Oh, you're not alone in that. Our brains are actually wired to get a little hit of dopamine. That feel-good chemical when we get something new? It's kind of like a reward system.
Yeah.
And it encourages us to collect resources. But the flip side is that letting go of things can trigger this feeling of loss. And for some people, that feeling is really, really intense.
So our brains are basically telling us to hold on to things, even if we don't really need them anymore.
Exactly. And for people with hoarding disorder, that urge can be amplified. One of your sources actually had a quote from a person with hoarding disorder, and they said, "I feel physical pain looking at an empty space."
Wow. That's a really powerful statement. It really shows you how much emotion is involved in hoarding. It's not just about the logic or the clutter. It's about these deep-seated feelings.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really crucial part of hoarding psychology, which is the impact of trauma and loss.
Okay. So how does trauma play a role in hoarding?
Well, a lot of people with hoarding disorder have gone through some kind of significant trauma or loss in their lives. It could be the death of a loved one, a natural disaster, a serious illness, any event that leaves them feeling vulnerable and out of control.
It's like their world has been turned upside down, and they're looking for something to hold on to.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Surrounding themselves with possessions can give them this feeling of safety and security in a world that feels really chaotic and unpredictable.
Almost like building a wall of stuff to protect themselves.
I like that. That's a good observation. And that feeling of needing to fill that empty space that we were talking about earlier, it could be connected to the void left by the trauma.
So the hoarding is kind of a way of coping with the pain and the fear.
It can be. Of course, it's important to remember that everybody copes with trauma in different ways. But for some people, hoarding can become a way to manage those tough emotions. And it's not always just about coping with something that happened in the past. Sometimes it's about trying to control the future, so like holding on to things just in case you might need them someday. That can make people feel more prepared, like they're ready for anything.
Oh yeah, I totally get that, just in case. Thinking. I have a whole drawer of stuff I'm sure I'll need someday, even though I haven't touched it in years.
It's a very human thing. But for somebody with hoarding disorder, that need for control can take over. They might feel like they need to save absolutely everything, which obviously can become a huge problem.
Totally. It's like that line between being prepared and being out of control gets all blurry.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I think we should talk about is this idea that hoarding is just something that happens to older people. Because some of your research actually said that hoarding behaviors can start way earlier in life.
Yeah, that's a myth for sure. Hoarding behaviors can actually start when people are teenagers. It can affect people of all ages, of course, but it's interesting how those tendencies can show up so early.
That's surprising. I always thought it was something that happened later in life. Why do you think it starts so young?
Well, adolescence is a time when there are so many changes. Teenagers are figuring out who they are, dealing with social pressure, trying to be more independent. So for some people, holding on to things can make them feel more stable and comfortable during all that.
So it's like creating a safe space when everything else feels uncertain.
Exactly. And as we get older, life keeps throwing us curveballs. Hoarding can get worse in adulthood, especially after big life events, like losing a loved one or a job or even retiring. Those kinds of transitions can really shake things up and create a sense of emptiness that some people try to fill with stuff.
Almost like those possessions become replacements for what's missing.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And as we age, there are other things that can contribute to hoarding too, like physical limitations and cognitive decline. It might be harder to stay on top of cleaning and organizing, which makes it easier for clutter to build up.
So it's not just about willpower or laziness then?
No, not at all. Hoarding disorder is a complex condition, and it has really deep psychological roots. And remember, it can affect people at any point in their lives. But the good news is that there is hope, and that's what we're going to talk about next.
Okay, good. I was starting to get a little worried there. Let's talk about what kinds of treatments and resources are out there for hoarding disorder, because your research had some really promising information.
One of the most effective ways to treat hoarding disorder is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. Isn't that used for a lot of different mental health issues?
Yeah, it is. CBT can be helpful for things like anxiety and depression. With hoarding disorder, it helps people understand how their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all connected, especially when it comes to their possessions.
So like, for example, somebody might think, I can't throw this away. What if I need it someday? And CBT would help them to question that thought.
Exactly. Therapists who use CBT will work with people to figure out those unhelpful thought patterns and come up with more realistic and balanced ways of thinking about their things.
So it's about changing how they view their stuff, but isn't it also about changing their actions, not just their thoughts?
Absolutely. CBT also involves practical strategies to manage clutter and to help people decide what to keep and what to let go of. This often includes something called exposure therapy. It might sound a little intimidating, but it's actually really effective.
What exactly is exposure therapy? I'm guessing it involves facing your fears.
Yeah, you got it. Exposure therapy is about gradually confronting the anxiety that comes with getting rid of things. So a therapist might start by having somebody throw away something small, like an old magazine or a pen that doesn't work anymore. Then as they get more comfortable, they can move on to things that are harder to let go of.
So it's like taking baby steps to get over the fear of letting go.
Exactly. And over time, with the help of a therapist, people can learn to deal with their anxiety and develop a healthier relationship with their things.
That's great. But I imagine it's still really challenging.
It is. But CBT can be really powerful for making changes. There are other therapies that can help too, like acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. That one focuses on helping people to accept their thoughts and feelings about their stuff without judging themselves, and then to take actions that match their values, even if it's a little uncomfortable.
So instead of trying to avoid those feelings of anxiety or guilt about letting go, you learn to acknowledge them and then make a choice to move forward anyway.
Yeah, that's the idea. ACT encourages people to focus on what really matters to them and to let go of the things that are holding them back, both physically and emotionally.
So it's like shifting the focus from avoiding discomfort to actually living a more meaningful life.
Exactly. And for somebody with hoarding disorder, that can make a world of difference.
This is all so helpful. But I know it can be really hard for the families and friends of people who hoard too. It's not just about the person struggling, it affects everyone around them. What advice would you give to somebody who's trying to support a loved one with hoarding disorder?
That's such an important point. It can be really tough to see someone you love struggling with hoarding. And it's natural to want to help, but you have to remember that you can't force somebody to change. If you try to clean up their space for them or throw things away without asking, it's probably going to backfire and hurt your relationship.
That makes sense. It sounds like patience and understanding are super important.
Absolutely. And education, too. The more you know about hoarding disorder, the better you'll be able to support your loved one.
Are there any good resources you would recommend for families and friends? Places they can go for information and support?
There's a website called childrenofhoarders.com. It's made specifically to help families and friends of people with hoarding disorder.
Okay, childrenofhoarders.com. What kind of stuff can people find there?
They have tons of resources, information about hoarding disorder, tips for talking to a loved one who hoards, strategies for setting boundaries. They even have a list of therapists who specialize in hoarding disorder, so you can find professional help in your area.
That's awesome. I'll make sure to put that link in the show notes. Are there any other organizations that can help?
Another good one is the International OCD Foundation, or IOCDF. Their website is iocdf.org.
Wait, why the OCD Foundation? I thought we talked about how hoarding isn't considered a type of OCD anymore.
You're right, it's its own separate disorder now, but the IOCDF still has a lot of good information about hoarding, like treatment options, research updates, support groups. They have a whole section of their website about it.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about a lot today. The genetic and emotional roots of hoarding, effective treatment approaches, resources for loved ones. What's the one thing you want our listener to take away from this?
I think the most important thing to remember is that hoarding disorder is treatable. It doesn't have to control your life or the lives of your loved ones. With the right support and treatment, people with hoarding disorder can get better. They can take back their living spaces and improve their well-being. It's a journey, but it's worth it.
Yeah, that's a really hopeful message. I think it's important for people to understand that. Hoarding disorder is not like a personal failing or something to be ashamed of. It's a real condition that deserves compassion and understanding.
Definitely. Just like with any mental health challenge, asking for help is a sign of strength.
You know, before we finish up this deep dive, I have one more question for you. And it's something I bet our listeners are wondering too. We've talked a lot about hoarding disorder. But do you think there's a spectrum when it comes to how we relate to our stuff? Like, could any of us have hoarding tendencies, even if we don't meet the criteria for an actual disorder?
That's a really interesting question. And I think the answer is probably yes. We all get attached to things to some extent. It's part of being human. We develop sentimental feelings about objects. We connect them to memories. It's natural to have a hard time letting go sometimes, even if something isn't useful anymore.
Oh yeah, I totally get that. I have a box of old letters in my attic. I know I should probably toss them, but I just can't. Too many memories.
Yeah, and that's completely normal. It only becomes a problem when collecting and saving things starts to interfere with our lives, like our well-being, our relationships, our ability to function. When the clutter takes over and causes real distress, that's when you know it's time to get help.
So it's about finding that balance, appreciating the sentimental things, but not letting them rule our lives.
Exactly. It's about being aware of how we think about our possessions and knowing when we might need some support. And remember, there's no shame in reaching out. It means you're taking care of yourself.
I love that. Well, this has been such an eye-opening deep dive. I hope our listener feels like they can learn more and maybe explore if there are any tendencies they see in themselves or people they know.
Me too. The more we understand about the psychology of hoarding, the better we can support ourselves and the people around us.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. You've been amazing.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk about this important stuff.
And to our listener, thank you for being so curious. We hope this deep dive helped you understand the psychology of hoarding a little better. If you want to learn more, we'll put links to all the resources we mentioned in the show notes. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and take care.